Eastern Laos, the spring of 1968. A North Vietnamese tracker kneels in wet ground at the edge of a stream bed and works through a piece of arithmetic he has done 1,000 times. He is good at it. He has been good at it since he was a boy following deer through these same mountains, and the war has only sharpened the gift. The helicopter came in 2 hours ago. He heard it. Everyone within a mile heard it. A team is on the ground now, and a team on the ground moves at a certain speed through a certain kind of country. And that speed is a number he carries in his body, the way other men carry the weight of a rifle. 2 hours. So many meters an hour through secondary growth. Less where the vines pull at a man's legs, more where the ground opens out. He looks toward the low ridge where the math says the team should be by now. And he stands, and his company moves behind him. The arithmetic was sound. The error did not belong to the tracker. It belonged to the team he was chasing, and they had built it into the ground on purpose. When he reaches the place his numbers promised him, there is nothing there. No fresh sign, no warm trail, no men. There is old ground and a single crushed fern that could be an hour old or could be 3. And the wrongness of it lands in his chest before his mind can put a word to it. He has been hunting at the speed of a man who runs. The men he is hunting have decided not to be men who run. Behind him, in ground he already walked past and dismissed as empty, 6 of them are lying still in cover, so close to his own boot prints that one of them could have reached out and touched his heel as he went by. They had covered, in 2 hours, the distance he assumed any team would cover in 15 minutes. By moving that slowly, by refusing the one thing every nerve in a hunted man screams for, they had stepped outside the only equation he knew how to solve. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow, we've got something special lined up just for you. That was the rule. It had no name and no page in any manual. It looked, from the outside, like a kind of madness, like men too frightened to move. It was the opposite of that. And in the first years of the secret war, on ground where the average team was being found and killed faster than the program could replace it, a handful of men worked it out for themselves and lived because of it. The North Vietnamese army fielded some of the finest light trackers any war has produced. Men who could read a broken stem the way you read a sentence. They cracked almost everything the Americans tried. This one thing they could not crack, because it did not break the way a technique breaks. It broke the assumptions underneath the technique. To understand why that mattered, you have to start where the men started, which is not in a war room and not on a map stuck with colored pins. You start in the dark, on a dirt strip in the Central Highlands, with 6 men checking their gear one last time, before a helicopter carries them across a border their own government swears does not exist. The unit was called the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The name was chosen to be boring. It sounds like a room full of clerks with clipboards, and that was the whole intention, because what it actually did could never be said out loud. It was stood up on the 24th of January 1964 to fight the half of the war that happened off the map. By the middle of the decade, the generals in Saigon had a problem that regular battalions could not solve. The enemy in the south was being fed, armed, and reinforced down a road that did not run through South Vietnam at all. It ran down the spine of Laos and into Cambodia, through countries that were neutral on paper and in every public speech, and no American line unit was allowed to set foot on it. So the command reached for the men who could go where battalions could not. In the autumn of 1965, they approved the first cross-border missions into Laos, under the name Shining Brass. When the name leaked into a newspaper, they changed it to Prairie Fire and kept going. 2 years later, they opened a second front into Cambodia, called Daniel Boone, later renamed Salem House. New names over the same idea. A handful of men over a line that was not supposed to exist, into the heart of an enemy who knew that ground far better than they ever would. The teams launched from a string of compounds along the border, and one of them sat at Kontum, in the highlands, far enough from Saigon that the war there looked nothing like the war in the papers. The town was small and dusty. Chickens wandered the roads, old French buildings came apart slowly in the heat, and children sold cigarettes outside the market. Behind a perimeter wall that everyone in town could see, sat the compound that the men inside called Command and Control Central. It looked like a base because it was a base. What it was, underneath that, was a launching pad for missions the United States denied were happening. The men who flew out of it crossed into Laos and Cambodia on operations, with no paper trail, no acknowledgement, and no overland rescue if things went badly, because no overland rescue could come. They called the ground over the border denied territory. The men who walked it had other words for it. A recon team was a small thing, 2 or 3 American Special Forces soldiers, and with them, a handful of indigenous fighters, mountain tribesmen, the Green Berets trusted with their lives, because those men could move through that country as if they had been born to it, which most of them had. There were Montagnards from the highlands, Bru and Raid and others. And there were Nungs, ethnic Chinese fighters with a hard reputation, and sometimes Cambodians. The American who ran the team was called the 1-0. It was not a rank. Ranks did not matter much across the border, and names were better left behind. The 1-0 was simply the man who decided, the man whose reading of a situation meant the team came home or did not. And the good ones were treated by everyone around them as the most valuable thing in that whole strange war, because they were. The enemy waiting in that ground was the North Vietnamese army. And by the late 1960s, the NVA had been watching American insertions long enough to understand them from the inside. They knew which helicopter corridors the teams used. They knew the kind of clearing a team would pick to land in. They had studied the way American recon elements moved through secondary growth and triple canopy, and they had built something designed for one job, which was to find those teams and kill them before they could do any real harm. Not ordinary infantry. Dedicated counter-reconnaissance. Whole companies of men whose single purpose in the war was to hunt the cross-border teams. And at the front of those companies, the trackers. The trackers were the heart of the problem. They moved through the jungle reading the ground, the way a person reads a page. And what they read was the story of a team that believed it had left no story at all. A pressed leaf on a muddy bank. A boot scrape in soft earth near a root. A single broken spiderweb at shoulder height across a game trail. A column of disturbed ants crossing a fallen log. They could follow a team that thought it had vanished. And they could close the distance faster than most Americans believed was possible. They had grown up in terrain like this. Some of them had tracked pigs and deer before they ever tracked a man. And the jungle had taught them before any army did. A bent blade of grass gave them a time. A crushed leaf gave them a weight. A line of disturbed earth gave them a direction, a number, a pace. They could kneel where another man saw nothing at all, and tell you how many had passed, how heavy their loads, whether they were tired, whether they were afraid. The standard answer to this threat came straight out of the training manuals. And on paper, it was sound. Move slowly. Step on roots and rock, not soft earth. Avoid wet ground and tall grass. Cross streams at the narrow points. Leave as little sign as you can. Every word of it was correct, and in the field, it was getting men killed. In the first stretch of cross-border operations, by the accounts of the men who ran them and the after-action reports that stacked up at the launch sites, a large share of recon insertions were compromised inside the first day on the ground. Teams were being found before they reached their first rally point, before they had done a single thing they were sent in to do. The doctrine written to keep them alive was the same doctrine that made them readable, and the men dying under it were among the finest light infantry the United States Army had ever trained. The trouble was never that the Americans moved carelessly. Every man crossing that border had been selected and trained to a standard that filtered out most people who tried for it. The trouble was that careful movement is predictable movement. Careful movement through jungle follows the logic of the ground. It goes around the thick brush. It steps on the firm earth. It stays off the open ridgeline, and crosses the water at the easy point, and avoids anything that might hold a clean footprint. The trackers understood that logic better than the Americans did, because they had lived inside it their whole lives. A good tracker could stand at a landing zone, look at the country around it, and tell you with fair accuracy where a team following standard discipline would be 2 hours later. The Americans were obeying a set of rules they did not know they were obeying, and the men hunting them had memorized every one of those rules long before the helicopters ever arrived. This is the war that ate the teams. The numbers from it sit at the edge of belief. Over the life of the secret war, the recon companies took losses that ran past 100%. More men hit than were ever carried on the rolls at one time, because the same men went out and were hit and went out again. There were stretches when nearly every recon man was wounded at least once inside a year, and something close to half of them were killed. It was the highest sustained loss rate the American Army had seen since its own Civil War a century earlier. The men who served there came to live by a grim little bargain. You would leave your tour with a medal for your wounds, or you would leave it in a bag, and there was not much room in between. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If a war told straight, with nothing dressed up to make it easier, is the kind of thing you came here for, then subscribe and stand watch with us. There is more of this coming, and none of it sounds like anything else. Into that math walked a small number of men who started to notice something the reports were almost shouting. The teams that lasted longest were not the teams following the doctrine most carefully. They were the teams doing something else. Something that looked from the outside like poor movement discipline, like men who had gotten lost. The teams that came back were making wrong turns on purpose. They stopped in places that offered no cover. They doubled back through ground they had just walked. And more than anything else, more than any trick of direction, they were slow, in a way that made no sense to anyone reading their routes from the outside. They were violating the logic of the ground so completely that a man watching their movement on a map would have assumed they were confused. They were not confused. They had simply refused to let the jungle make their decisions. And the largest decision they had taken back was the decision about time. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what a tracker is actually doing when he works a trail. He is not simply following footprints. A man following footprints is a man who is always behind. A skilled tracker is not behind. He is running a calculation, and the calculation is almost always ahead of the team he is hunting. Here is what the calculation looks like. The tracker finds a point of entry, a place where boots touched down, where grass was pressed, where a branch deflected and stayed deflected. He finds a second point, further along. He measures the freshness of the sign between them, the moisture still in a broken stem, the degree to which disturbed soil has begun to settle, the way insects have or haven't returned to a crushed patch of ground. From the freshness he reads time. From the distance between points and the time elapsed he builds a rate. And from the rate he builds a future. He does not arrive at where the team was. He arrives at where the rate says the team must be by the time he gets there. This is the art and the danger of it. A team moving at a predictable pace was handing the tracker the one variable his entire method depended on. Every footstep at that speed was a statement of intent, and the tracker was fluent in that language. The counter to it was not to move more carefully through the same ground at the same speed. It was to move at a speed that could not be turned into a rate. Take the rate away and the whole calculation falls apart. The freshness of a broken fern no longer tells the tracker how far ahead the team is, because distance is rate multiplied by time, and he no longer has a rate he can trust. The men who understood this began to move impossibly slowly. A team would cover, in a full hour, the kind of ground a fit man could cross at a relaxed walk in a few minutes. They moved one careful foot at a time, weight rolling down through the outside of the boot, to keep the heel from striking first, and snapping whatever was underfoot. The lead man froze, with his foot still in the air, held it there, listened to the jungle settle around him, and only then set it down. They went slowly enough that brush closed behind them without a sound, that no stem broke because no stem was ever struck at speed, that the marks they left were the marks of men who had all the time in the world and spent it on each individual step. The point man might spend 20 minutes deciding how to cross 6 feet of open ground. Not because he was unsure of the direction, because 6 feet of open ground, crossed wrong, at the wrong angle, and the wrong speed, tells a story to the man reading it later. And the story is one you do not want told. And then, having moved like that for an hour, having accumulated the kind of distance that would embarrass a unit on a training exercise, the team would stop, and not move at all. The halts were the second half of the rule, and they were longer and harder than the movement itself. A team would go to ground and lie still for an hour, for 2 hours, for longer, without a word, without a radio transmission, without so much as shifting a leg that had gone completely numb. The man whose arm was under his chest did not move his arm. The man whose face was an inch from an ant trail watched the ants and did not move his face. The point of the halt was not rest. Rest was incidental. The point was to break the rate completely. A tracker working a fresh trail operates on an assumption that is almost always correct. The men he is hunting are still moving. Men keep moving. It is what men do when they are afraid and exposed and trying to get somewhere safer. The tracker paces himself accordingly, building his own speed against the arithmetic of the gap closing at a steady rate. A team that has gone to ground and stayed there has taken the gap and frozen it. The tracker, still moving at the pace his calculations set, runs through the position where the team should be, and out the far side of it, past men who are lying at his feet, because the math no longer has a clock it can use. He does not know this yet. He keeps going, because the rate says they are ahead of him, and by the time he has figured out that the rate lied, he is somewhere else entirely, and the team is already moving again, in a direction his calculations cannot predict, because they no longer have a foundation. And then, having confused the rate by going slow, and broken it entirely by stopping, the survivors did the third thing, which was to make sure no rhythm ever established itself at all. A team that moves slowly, at a consistent slow speed, has only traded one readable rate for another. The tracker adjusts. He learns what slow looks like in the sign, recalibrates his arithmetic, and runs the same calculation at a lower number. So the teams varied their pace on purpose, not randomly, but with intention. A burst of slightly faster movement across hard ground that would hold no sign, then back to the crawl. A long halt, then a short one, then no halt, where an exhausted team would surely have taken one. They never let the tracker find a pattern in the tempo, because a pattern in the tempo is a rate in disguise, and a rate in any form was the one thing they could not afford to give him. The whole craft compressed down to a single sentence a man could carry in his head when his hands were shaking and the light was failing. Never give the hunter your tempo. Let him have the ground. Let him have your direction if he must. Never let him have your clock. The men who took to this rule most naturally were not the Americans. They were the tribesmen who ran point. A Montagnard or a Nung who had grown up moving through that country, either to hunt or to keep from being hunted, already carried half of the rule in his body before any American explained it to him. The patience. The willingness to spend an hour and gain almost nothing measured in distance. The deep stillness that a man learns when stillness is the difference between eating and going hungry, between coming home and not coming home. What developed between an American 1-0 and his indigenous point man over enough missions was not quite trust in the ordinary sense of the word, and not quite friendship, though it was sometimes that too. It was closer to a shared set of reflexes, a single nervous system distributed across two bodies, built mission by mission, until a flat hand pressed against the ground communicated more than a paragraph could. The American did not always teach the rule to those men. Often enough he learned it from them, watched the way the small tribesmen ahead of him refused to be hurried by anything the jungle produced, and understood that the refusal was not stubbornness. It was the whole point. It sounds like a small adjustment. Move slower. Stop longer. Vary the rhythm. It was not a small adjustment. It was a demand that a man stand directly against every instinct combat builds in him. Every reflex a soldier develops pushes him toward speed when he is afraid. Cover ground. Put distance between yourself and the place that feels wrong. The jungle reinforces that instinct because, most of the time, it keeps you alive. Speed gets you away from the source of the threat. Speed keeps the enemy from fixing your position. Speed is survival logic, and it is correct logic in most tactical situations. But the jungle was not what was killing these teams. The men who could read the jungle were killing them, and those men were better at reading it than any American was going to become in 1 tour or 2 tours or 5. The slow rule asked a man to do the hardest thing combat ever asks, which is to act against his own nervous system, to move at the speed of something sleeping, while every cell in his body is screaming at him to run. The men who could do that became, for practical purposes, impossible to track. Not invisible. Nobody in that jungle was invisible. They had simply removed the tool the tracker was best with, and left him standing at the place where his numbers ended and guessing began. The mechanics held up every time they were tested, because the logic was clean all the way through. A tracker reading a normal trail is solving an equation with 3 known values and 1 unknown. He knows approximately where the team inserted. He can measure how fresh the most recent sign is. He knows, from a lifetime in that specific country, how fast a laden team moves through that type of vegetation. From those 3 values he solves for the 4th, where the team is now. Take away the 3rd value, make the pace unreliable and unreadable, and the whole equation loses its foundation. The freshness of the sign no longer translates into distance, because the conversion factor is gone. A crushed fern that would mean the team is 200 meters ahead if they moved at a normal pace, now means almost nothing. They could be 200 meters ahead, or they could be lying in the undergrowth at the tracker's feet, having spent the last 90 minutes covering the length of a small room. The tracker is reduced from a man who predicts to a man who guesses, and a man who guesses in that country, against teams that had turned patience into a weapons system, did not guess productively for very long. The same logic governed the danger areas, the trail crossings and open stretches, that no amount of slowness could make safe on their own. A high-speed trail, a wide and well-used path cut through the jungle by years of foot traffic, was where a team was most exposed and most likely to be under observation, and standard doctrine said to cross it fast and at the narrowest point. The surviving teams did something closer to the opposite. They stopped well short of the trail and studied it, sometimes for the better part of an hour, looking for the watcher who might be positioned in the canopy above it, or sitting in shadow on the far side. They sent the team across one man at a time, each man placing his boot carefully into the print left by the man before him, so that the sign on the far bank read as a single crossing rather than 6. They crossed not at the obvious narrow point, but at a place that offered no cover and no tactical logic. Exactly because it had no tactical logic. Exactly because no sensible unit would choose it. And a man setting up to watch a trail crossing sets up where sensible units cross. After the crossing, before the team pushed on toward the objective, they would often loop back in a slow, wide arc and lie up where they could observe the ground they had just moved through, watching to see whether anyone came to read the sign behind them. The Australians called this the hook. It cost time. Everything about the rule cost time. But time was the currency they had decided to spend, because time was the one asset the tracker could not recover once a team had taken it from him. Set it on the ground and watch it work. A 6-man element inserts into the Laotian panhandle in the late afternoon, when the light through the canopy has gone orange, and the air carries so much moisture that breathing feels like effort. They came in the way teams always came in. A single aircraft running fast and low under the tree line. The pilot dropping toward one clearing as if to land, and then pulling up and sliding sideways to deposit the team into a different one, so that any watcher who marked the first clearing was already pointing the wrong direction. The helicopter is on the skids for less than 30 seconds. The team moves off the ramp and into the tree line before the rotor wash has finished flattening the grass, and the aircraft climbs away, and the sound of it shrinks and disappears, and then there is nothing behind them at all. No friendly line, no artillery that can range this far, no ground element that can reach them overland if the situation falls apart, because no ground element exists that could get here in time. They are a dozen miles inside a country that will officially deny they were ever born, and the only way home is straight up, which requires a helicopter, which requires a landing zone, which requires staying alive long enough to reach one. They do not push for the objective. They begin to crawl. The point man, a small Brew tribesman who has been running recon since before the Americans had a settled institutional name for what they were doing, takes the team into the worst ground available. The steep, the thorned, the drainage cuts choked with wait-a-minute vines that grab at every piece of kit and require a man to stop and work himself free before he can take the next step. He takes them through it at a pace that would embarrass a man moving in his sleep. An hour passes. They have covered a few hundred meters. The orange light in the canopy goes gray, then goes out. They find a low rise with a sightline back across the ground they just crossed. They go flat. They do not move. Somewhere behind them, a man is finding the place where the grass was pressed down for 30 seconds by a helicopter that is now 100 miles away. He is looking at the tree line. He is beginning to work out the calculation. He has 2 of his 3 values already. He will spend the rest of the night looking for the third, and he will not find it, because 6 men on a low rise in the dark have decided that he will not, and they have the patience to make that decision stick. The trackers come 2 hours after the helicopter, the way they always do. 2 men out front, low and fast, reading the ground as they go, and behind them, the rest of the company strung out under the trees. The lead tracker is good. He finds the team's entry into the tree line and slows. He measures the freshness of it, the give in the soil, the color in the broken edge of a stem, and he builds his rate. And his rate tells him the team has had 2 hours and is well up toward the high ground by now. moving for its objective like any team would. He commits to that. He and his partner choose a line that carries them toward where the math says the team has gone, fast. Because a fast team has to be caught fast. And they pass within 40 meters of the rise. And the company passes behind them. 100 men moving at the pace of men who believe the gap is closing. On the rise, the team lies in wet brush and watches 100 enemy soldiers walk past the place they are hiding, toward a place they never went. The little brew has his hand flat against the earth at his side. Every man on the team has been watching that hand for the last several minutes. The hand means do not move. Do not breathe loudly. Do not swallow if you can help it. The jungle does what the jungle always does. The canopy shifts in a breeze that never reaches the ground. Insects move through the undergrowth in patterns that have nothing to do with 6 men lying in it. A bird calls once from above the ridge and goes quiet. The smell is wet soil and rotting leaves, and the particular heaviness of air that has not moved in a long time. The lead tracker is 40 meters away, and certain, and his certainty is built on a rate the team took from him the moment they chose to crawl. He is hunting a team that should be 1,000 meters from here. The team is under his nose, and it is invisible to him not because it cannot be seen, but because his method has told him to look somewhere else. The team holds for an hour after the last of the company has gone by. Then it holds for a while longer, because the rule does not end when the danger walks past. The danger walks past, and the team waits to see whether anyone comes back down the same line. And only when the jungle has been quiet long enough to trust, does the little brew lift his hand and turn the team, slowly, toward the work it came to do. The mission runs for days. The team watches a stretch of trail, counts trucks under cut branches, marks the stacks of crates, and the men moving unhurried between grass-roofed shelters, certain in their bones that no American force could ever reach this deep. The team calls it in. Air assets are redirected against the supply routes on the strength of what those 6 men saw. And when the time comes to leave, there is no gunfight at the extraction, no close pursuit through the tree line. For a recon element in denied territory in those years, a result like that stood out so sharply that men talked about it back at the compound. And not everyone who talked about it believed at first that the reason was something as plain as moving slowly. If you have stayed with the team this far, you already understand the kind of nerve this asked of a man. Subscribe, and we will keep walking this ground together. Now back to the rise, and to the cost of what those 6 men did. Because the hard part was never the slow movement itself. A man can train his feet. The hard part was the hour on the ground, with a tracker walking toward him, and every nerve in his body screaming the wrong instruction. Fear does a specific thing in that moment. It does not want a man to be still. It wants him up and running. It wants him on the radio calling the helicopters, braking for the extraction corridor, getting back to ground where his own government admits he exists. Fear is loud, and it makes a very reasonable case for doing exactly the thing that gets a team killed, which is to move now, to move fast. What made the rule work was not that the men running it felt no fear. Every one of them felt it. What made it work was that certain men had learned to treat fear as bad tactical advice. They understood that the tracker 40 meters away was also reading fear, that he was hunting for the kind of movement fear produces, the pace that runs a little too fast. The route that keeps bending toward the extraction point, no matter what the ground says. The halt that gets cut short because the jungle feels wrong, and the team wants to be anywhere else. Fear expressed in movement is loud, and it is legible. And a fast, frightened team writes its position across the ground in a hand any tracker can read. A team that had learned to lie completely still when everything in it said go, and to move at the speed of growing grass when everything in it said run, had taken away the tracker's 2 best tools at once. It had refused him a rate, and it had refused him the panic that would have handed the rate back. The teams that did not run the rule with real discipline showed up in the after-action reports. And the reports were specific about how. A team that cut a halt short because the insertion had run long, and the objective was still far off. A team that picked up the pace through difficult ground because the slow crawl through it felt like too much exposure for too little distance. A team that moved just a shade too directly, a shade too logically, toward where it was going, and was found inside a day because a tracker read that logic and walked it straight in. The gap between understanding the rule and executing it, when your hands were shaking, and the dark was coming, and the helicopters were an hour out, was the gap that separated the teams that came home from the teams that did not. It was never as wide as it needed to be. One report carried the shape of it without any of the words a man would want to read. A team had inserted late, the helicopter held up by weather, and the light was already failing when they hit the ground. The objective was farther than the team liked, and the 1-0 made a decision any tired man might make. He kept the movement slow, but he shaved the halts. An hour on the ground became 40 minutes. 40 became 20. He was still moving more slowly than a normal patrol, still doing most of the rule, and most of the rule was not enough. The trouble with a rate is that it does not need the whole of a team's tempo to rebuild itself. It needs a thread of regularity, a pace the tracker can lean on, and a team that halts on a rhythm, even a slow one, has handed him a thread. The tracker working that trail found his thread before first light. He did not have to guess where the team would be, because the team had given its clock back to him, one shortened halt at a time. The contact came in the gray before dawn, on ground the team had not chosen. At a moment, the team did not pick. Some of them came home. Not all of them did. The report that followed did not say the team had moved carelessly, because it had not. It said the team had moved almost slowly enough, and almost was the whole distance between the men who walked out and the men whose names went onto a wall. The North Vietnamese were not an enemy that left a problem alone. They studied their own trackers' reports, the way the Americans studied the after-action stacks. And they were asking the same question from the other side. Something about the teams coming back was different. Their best men who had never failed to run down a trail, were losing teams that by every measure should have been caught, and the trackers could not always say how. A trail would go cold, not because it had been hidden, but because it had, in some way they struggled to name, slowed to nothing, and then started again somewhere the rate said it could not be. So the enemy adapted, the way the enemy always adapted, and the rule that had been quietly keeping men alive began to force an evolution on both sides. The tracker units that had worked in pairs began to spread out, deploying in loose groups of 3 and 4 to cover more ground, on the theory that if the quarry was somehow folding time, more eyes across more of the country might catch it doing so. In sectors with heavy helicopter traffic, the enemy brought in dogs, because a dog does not care about your tempo. A dog reads scent, and scent does not care how slowly you move. The teams answered that the way they had learned to answer everything, by attacking the dog's tool the way they attacked the trackers. They went sterile before they crossed, scrubbing themselves of the smell of American rations, eating the enemy's food, and drinking the enemy's drink, so that the scent they left behind would read as the enemy's own. They wore the enemy's sandals, and carried the enemy's weapons, and the enemy's ammunition, so that even a firefight would for a moment sound like the wrong side. They crossed water where they could, and stepped in one another's prints, so that 6 men read as one, and they layered the scent discipline under the tempo discipline, until the dogs, too, began to lose trails that by every law of the nose should have held. Prepositioned reaction forces stopped waiting to be called in after a tracker made contact, and started placing themselves near the likely extraction corridors before anyone moved. Every adjustment the teams made pushed the enemy to adjust in return, and the teams had to keep moving ahead of that response, because a trick the enemy has learned is a trick that gets you killed. There is a moment that stands for the whole of that contest, though it happened in some form on many days and to many teams. A handler works a dog along a stream bank where a team is known to have crossed, the animal straining at the line, certain, because a dog is always certain. The scent is there. The scent says men. The handler follows it up off the bank and into the growth, and the dog pulls him along with no hesitation, and then the line goes slack. The dog circles. It casts left and right with its nose down, and the certainty drains out of it, because the scent it was following has done something scent is not supposed to do. It does not smell of American men. It smells of fish sauce and rice, and the same cigarettes the handler's own friends smoke. And it does not lead anywhere. It simply ends, in a place where a team should have walked on, and instead seems to have walked into the air. The handler stands in the brush, with a confused animal, and the slow understanding that he has been reading a trail built to be read, and then to stop. The team that left it is 100 meters off in cover. No one will search, lying still, listening to a dog lose them, having taken from the animal the one thing it trusted, which was the difference between the smell of the hunter and the smell of the hunted. This is the part that an honest telling has to include. The rule was never a solution that stayed solved. It was a running argument between two sides, each studying the other and changing, and neither side ever stopped. The enemy did not break. His counter-reconnaissance companies were wrecked on the ground time and again, and his army absorbed the losses the way it absorbed everything, and it raised more. For every company a team shattered, the enemy stood up another, put more watchers in the trees, more lookouts on the landing zones, more trackers on the roads at first light, to guard the trail against teams that could be anywhere and were almost impossible to catch. He had to commit a force out of all proportion to the few hundred men hunting him. The figure most often cited is on the order of tens of thousands of soldiers, whole divisions that should have been fighting in the south, instead strung along the trail looking for ghosts, watching empty sky, sweeping empty road. A tiny number of men, by being unfindable, were pulling a small army out of the real war. That, more than any single team that came home clean, was the thing the teams were truly for, and the teams won their fights. By the turn of the decade, the cross-border elements were fighting at the worst odds in the war. A few men against an army, and posting a kill ratio that the men who keep such records put at better than 100 to 1, among the most lopsided in American military history. It was not that the teams were bulletproof. We have already seen what the war cost them. The wounds past 100%, the bargain of the medal or the bag. It was that when a handful of men who could not be found chose the moment and the ground, and could call down the entire weight of the air when they needed it, the math of an ordinary fight stopped applying. The slow rule was a piece of that. It bought the teams the one thing that made all the rest possible, which was the chance to choose, to be the ones deciding when a fight happened, instead of the ones a tracker decided to spring it on. If these men are worth remembering, and they are, then the most useful thing any of us can do is keep the story being told straight, subscribe, and pass it on. The program did not end cleanly, because nothing in that war ended cleanly. As American involvement in Southeast Asia began its long contraction, the missions across the border grew less frequent, and the men who had run recon into Laos and Cambodia for years came off operational status, rotated home, or were reassigned to units that did not cross any borders. The unit that ran the secret war was switched off in 1972 and filed away, and for a generation the men who had crossed the fence carried it in silence, forbidden to tell even their families where they had been or what they had done. The missing stayed missing. The records stayed sealed. A war that had bent an enemy army around a few hundred ghosts on a road was, to the country that fought it, a war that had officially never happened. The deniability that made the whole thing possible was also its hardest price. Because the war across the border could not be admitted, the men lost in it could not always be properly claimed. Teams went into Laos and Cambodia and did not come out, and the official record was that there had been no one there to lose. Men were swallowed by jungle in countries their own government said they had never entered, and their families were handed a silence with no shape to it. For years, the missing of the secret war were missing twice. Once to the ground that took them, and once to the lie that had to be told to protect what the living were still doing. The knowledge those men carried did not get packed away with the equipment. It moved the way real knowledge moves, not through official channels, and not in published manuals with distribution lists and file numbers, but through the men themselves. The slow rule never got a ceremony. It never got a formal write-up with anyone's name attached, because it had never had one name attached to begin with. What it got was this. The men who used it and came home remembered it. And when those men became instructors and senior sergeants and planners in a special operations community that spent the years after Vietnam rebuilding itself almost from the ground up, they taught what they remembered. The movement principles that had been worked out on the ground in the Panhandle made their way into the techniques taught to the men who came after. They turned up in the reconnaissance doctrine of units whose names were not always spoken in public. The distances changed as the terrain changed. The timing adapted to different environments and different threats. The core of it stayed intact across all of it, because the core of it was never really about the jungle. An enemy who is better at reading your environment than you are will find you if you let that environment set your pace. So do not let it set your pace. Take back your clock, and you take back the one thing his whole art cannot do without. By the early 1980s, pieces of what those men had worked out across the border were standard practice in American special operations training, and the men teaching it often did not know where it had first come from. That is how this kind of knowledge travels. It loses its origin and keeps its content. The men who built it did not get the credit, and most of them never asked for it. The technique survived anyway. The men who used it and came home were the ones who carried it forward. They became the instructors and the senior sergeants, and the planners of a community that rebuilt itself almost from nothing in the years after the war. And they taught what they remembered, the distances changing as the ground changed and the core of it holding. There is no faster way to build something that genuinely works than to test it the way these men tested everything, where getting it right meant you came home, and getting it wrong meant a tracker had you before dark. And the special operations community eventually understood that the people closest to the actual problem, working with real consequences at their back, will always understand something the people watching from a distance cannot fully see. The question is only ever whether anyone in charge is paying enough attention to listen. And in those years, barely. The answer was yes, because enough men read enough reports to notice that the teams refusing to move at a human pace were the teams that kept coming back. Strip away the doctrine and the long reach of it into the present, and what is left is the men. And the men were not invincible. They went out again and again into ground where the odds said they would not all come back, and often enough they did not. The most famous of them was a sergeant named Jerry Shriver, a quiet, strange, brilliant soldier most at home in the worst places, who ran recon and raids deep into Laos and Cambodia, at the head of American Special Forces and their mountain fighters. He had extended his tours and turned down the promotions that would have pulled him off operational duty, and he had run more missions into denied territory than almost anyone still active. He kept a stray dog in the compound, and a collection of weapons the army had never issued him, and he had gone quiet in the way that men who have seen a great deal go quiet. Not damaged in any way you could point to, simply still. The enemy knew his name. The North's propaganda radio put a bounty on his head and hung the name Mad Dog on him, and it stuck. Because of all the men they were bleeding themselves to catch, he had become the face of the thing in the jungle they could not kill. On the 24th of April 1969, he went into Cambodia with a force of his mountain fighters, came down almost on top of a prepared enemy position, and judged at once that he was badly outnumbered. He was last seen moving toward the enemy guns rather than away from them. He was never recovered. His name is cut into the black granite of the wall in Washington, among more than 58,000 others. And if you stand in front of it on a quiet morning, you can see your own face looking back at you out of the stone. What is not on that wall, because walls cannot hold it, is the thing men like him actually left behind. Not a citation and not a field manual. A way of moving through ground that wanted to kill you. A set of hard ideas about fear and patience, and the difference between being invisible and being unreadable. Carried out of the jungle by the men who survived and passed forward across decades, into conflicts they never saw. America counted 13 of the men of the Secret War worthy of its highest award, the Medal of Honor, among them Robert Howard, who would be remembered as the most decorated American soldier of that entire war. Many more earned things that stayed locked in a file for a lifetime. And on the 4th of April 2001, more than 30 years after the first team stepped across the border into Laos, the country finally stood up at Fort Bragg and gave the men of the Secret War the recognition they had earned in the dark. A presidential unit citation for the whole outfit, the highest honor a unit can be given. For most of those 30 years, the men had not been allowed to say where they had been, not to friends and not to family. And the honor came late enough that some of the men it belonged to were no longer alive to stand in any formation at all. Old men stood in that one. Men who had crawled for an hour to cross a clearing, and lain still for 2, while 100 enemy soldiers walked past. And for the first time their country said out loud that it knew what they had done. The rule was never about removing danger. Every man who ran it understood that the danger was still there, that the tracker 40 meters away was real, that the bounty was real, that the wall in Washington was waiting, and would have its share of them no matter how slowly they moved. What the rule did was refuse to hand the man hunting you the one thing he needed to find you. The men who ran it best were not the men who felt the least fear when the tracker was close. They were the men who had understood something that fear will never teach you on its own, which is that stillness chosen on purpose, under the worst pressure there is not the absence of action. It is the hardest action there is. It has to be learned, it has to be practiced, and it has to be chosen again, every single time the situation demands it. against everything in your body that is begging you to do the opposite. The men who chose it enough times mostly came home and carried it forward, and the trackers who hunted them, some of the finest the world has ever produced, went to their graves having read the ground perfectly, and still, in the end, having been beaten by a few men who simply refused to be where the math said they had to be. If you've been watching this channel for a while and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.